Hi, everybody. Welcome to our channel, Our Scientology Stories, Peeling the Onion. My name is Mark Fisher, and I want to introduce my co-host, Janis Gillham Grady. Hi, Janis. How you doing today?
Aloha, Mark. G'day, everybody.
We're here for a special interview that Janis did several years ago with Ron Miscavige Snr on his channel. And last month I played the interview that he did with me, but we're going to play the interview that he did with Janis as well. And Ron was a friend of ours for quite some time. And Janis, I know you've got some stories and reflections you'd like to mention before we play the interview.
Yes. I think it was 2016 when it was decided to do a cruise. And so I believe this was the first SP cruise that was done. And the Headleys were on the cruise, and I was on it, and Paul was on it, and a bunch of the marketing people, Peter and Carrie Cook, were on it. And I've got some photographs here I'll show. But anyway, so we're going to go off on our first SP cruise. And here's our group photograph. In the front is Jeff Hawkins, and I'll go up the left side. Behind him is Betsy Byrne, and then Carrie Cook, Carolyn Mustard, and Peter Cook. And then going up the right side, I'm directly behind Jeff. And then there's Ron Miscavige next to me and his wife, Becky, in the white dress. Behind Ron is Dan Kuhn, and then George, who is married to Betsy, and Steve Hall. And Paul is missing from this photo. And there's several people missing from it. Mike Laws was on it. But anyway, that's part of the group. And Dan Kuhn was on the cruise working with Ron Miscavige most of the time, working on his book, Ruthless.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, so it was our first SP cruise going out of New Orleans, and we went down to Mexico and back into New Orleans. Can you go to the next slide?
Yeah.
Okay, here's the complete group. Dan Kuhn there on the left, George, who was not a Scientologist, in the front, Steve Hall, Mike Laws, Carrie Cook. Now, the reason she's got her stand-up bass there is Ron Sr. has this great idea. Everyone who's a musician, bring your instruments with you. So Carrie and Peter drove all the way from Vermont because she didn't want to fly with this big bass with her. Anyway, so when we were on the ship, those musicians would all get together and jam, and Ron would play his trumpet, George on guitar, Carrie on bass, and even Peter Cook. He found a tin trash can in the bathroom and pulled out his drumsticks, and he was playing the trash can. And we'd do this every night on the cruise, everyone having a great time. And I would go to social services and find an empty lounge where we could all hang out and do this. And it ended up with passengers coming and just sitting there and listening in. Anyway, it was a fun group. And then behind Mike Laws in the white T-shirt, there's Paul, my husband, who has since passed away, and then myself directly behind Steve Hall, and then Ron Miscavige in the white shirt in the center. And then you can see Claire and Mark Headley between Ron Miscavige and Peter Cook. Peter Cook's got the white hair and the white beard. Yeah. And then is
that Becky behind Ron?
Yes. And then Betsy, and then Jeff Hawkins, and Carolyn Mustard's son. Anyway, once the cruise was over, we stayed a couple of days extra in New Orleans and went exploring New Orleans. And Ron had happened to have a sore foot at the time, so he and Dan stayed behind at the hotel while the rest of us went exploring New Orleans. And one of the places we went was the cemetery, which is, they're famous for their above ground burial grounds. So we went to the cemetery, and what was funny is we're all gathered around. You can go to the next picture there. We're gathered around listening to this tour guide, and I turn around and I see this man here in a suit, and he's got earpieces in. I'm like, oh my God, this guy's spying on us. He's a PI or something. And so I took a picture of him, and then he suddenly disappeared, and we're doing our tour. And let's go to the next picture. This guy is now hanging around, and he's just standing back there listening and watching us. And every place we went, he went with us to the next grave, He was there. So we can go to the next picture. Oh, so this was later, but Jeff Hawkins did a shootout with him where Jeff squatted down and took a picture of him, and he squatted down and took a picture. So it's very obvious this guy is what is photographing us. And you can see Steve Hall laughing here because I said to this guy, I said, hey, come over here, get in the picture with us. And he's like, why do you want a picture of me? And Steve is laughing when I said, because you're taking photos of us. And you can tell this guy's kind of a little pissed off at me. But anyway, and then I posted these pictures on Facebook. But it was obvious, the shame of it is that Ron had a sore foot, and so he wasn't there with us. And you can bet, yeah, he was probably there mostly for Ron more than anybody else. But
Right.
We'd dealt with PIs before in Vegas. Anyway, in that evening, we went out and we walked down the main road. And
in New Orleans? New Orleans?
Yeah. He had prearranged with this guy to play with him. And then as we went down the road to the various bars, Ron would go in and ask if he could get up there and play with the different bands and the different bars and stuff. And we had a great time just hanging out, doing that type of thing.
Ron was always about music, wasn't he?
Yeah, he always about music, always had his trumpet with him. But anyway, I just thought that was a fun story to tell about the PI at the graveyard at the cemetery in New Orleans.
Janis, what are your reflections or remembrances about Ron Miscavige Snr. and your time with him over the years?
Ron was, he was different. And I must say, though I liked Ron, it was a lot all about Ron. And that's where I look at the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. When I look at DM, and the personalities are very similar in many ways. And even the voice and the accent, every time I saw Ron, it would remind me of Dave Miscavige.
Right.
Then that's, and a lot of those personality traits were there. But Ron had good points, a lot of good points. He was fun. Yeah, and it was all about music to him. And he was a character and joking and telling stories, and he even wrote little books telling little stories and stuff. He was a definite storyteller.
Yeah, and he obviously was not vindictive or like evil, in terms of the way he treated people, the way his son David did, right? I mean that
right,
was
but he did have an issue with abusing Loretta, his first wife. I don't believe he abused Becky, but he did with Loretta. And I remember watching Ron on Megyn Kelly's show where she says, well, they say here that you always beat your wife. And Ron says, no, I didn't always beat my wife. Only sometimes, maybe once a month or so. And I'm like, oh, did you just say that? Because to him,
he's basically admitting it. Yeah.
He's admitting it. And yeah, he did beat her, because then someone else told me a story where Loretta was upset because Ron had stopped beating her, or wasn't beating her as much. Meaning, did he not love her anymore because he wasn't beating her? So there was abuse within that family. But I'm not justifying it, because there was never abuse like that in my family. There was no hitting or beatings or anything like that. So it's not okay that it happened, but there's a lot of families that are like that, and they think it's normal.
Yeah, and he changed. I mean, he was not like physically abusive and stuff when he was on staff or when he was around me or anybody else. I just don't.
Right.
I'd never heard of it. It
No.
wasn't like Miscavige who was beating staff and all that. I mean, Ron was a pussycat, really. I mean, he could have a temper every once in a while, but a good joke would just set him off, and he'd just be really laughing and
Oh,
having a
yeah.
good time. And he loved to
Oh,
play music. He was a great musician,
yes.
and he loved it. There was
I
always
have
music.
these
He'd always bring his.
photographs.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I have these photographs around various different cruises that I should have put in here, but of Ron just goofing around and doing silly things, and so yeah. But I don't know of him ever abusing Becky.
Yeah,
So he got better as time went by.
that's right. Anyway, so you're gonna see Janis's interview with Ron from several years ago on his channel in just a minute. In the meanwhile, I just wanted to mention we've got both of Janis's books available on our merchandise store. If you go down below the comments, you'll see them featured there, and then you can pick up other items from our merchandise store as well: coffee mugs, Calm. T-shirts, you name it. We've got them all there. Not Robin Scott, but anyway.
Okay.
But if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please subscribe. Go to at Mark Fisher and Janis Gillham Grady. Hit that subscribe button and rock slam, right, Janis? That like button.
Yes, rock slam the like button. That's what we
Great.
like.
Anyway, we hope you enjoy the interview with Janis and Ron Miscavige Snr. It's about an hour long, and we'll see you next time.
Okay, bye.
Hello, I'm Ron Miscavige, and this is Life After Scientology. And let me do a couple commercials here so we can get them out of the way. As to start off with, the name of that song is Barnum and Gumbo, and that's from the album I did in 1974, which, if you have my book, Rootless, I talk about that. And that is the album that BBC heard and wanted me to play on the radio, which is available on my website. If you go to Music and Media, you can go and sample the songs or get a copy of the album for yourself. And one other point I'd like to make, and that is this, and this is a fairly important point. YouTube does not pay me to do this. We don't have any sponsor, so we're on our own dime. And the way you can support this program, if you like it and you like what we're doing, is go to my Patreon, and whatever you want to contribute, it would be very much appreciated, because I will continue to do this no matter what, because I think it's a good public service. Anyway, that's how you could help us a little bit financially. Okay, so this morning I have a special guest on. Her name is Janis Grady. God, I know her for decades, and has a fascinating story to tell. It's unique because she actually worked hand in fist with L. Ron Hubbard for many, many, many years. And she has written a book, and that's how you can get it on Amazon. And I'd love you to go there and buy a copy for yourself. So without any further fluff or anything for me to say, I'd like to welcome Janis. So Janis, over to you. Hello.
Great. Hi, Ron. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. Anyway, let me start off with my book. Here, I think you can see it there.
Yep.
It's Commodore's Messenger, A Child Adrift in the Scientology Sea Organization. And that's a picture of me. I guess I was probably about 13 with L. Ron Hubbard. And we're walking on the deck, the A deck of the Apollo.
Okay, so that's the book. And as I say, you can go on Amazon to order that. Now, as with our other guests, the way I like to start this is start at the beginning. Unique, right? Start at the beginning. All right. And what I'd like you to do is tell us, how did you get in Scientology? And probably you should tell us about your parents, Peter and Yvonne, who started an organization in Australia where they had people come in and take Scientology services and were very successful, for all I know. And why don't you start off with that and just tell us about a bit about that, Janis?
Okay. Well, my parents got into Scientology back in the early 50s, before I was even born. So they were in Brisbane, Australia, and my mother was a kindergarten teacher, Yvonne Gillham Gents, and my father, Peter Gillham, was an accountant. And my mother's assistant of the kindergarten had Dianetics and was telling my mother about it. And then she went to some meetings, and they tried to get my dad to come along, and Dad would have nothing to do with it. And then they talked about past lives, and that's when he got interested. And then he went to a seminar on self-analysis, where you do those little drills yourself, and he loved it. So they then moved to Sydney, where they could get more Scientology, because in Sydney was the only place where an American had come over and had set up a little operation. So they started training as auditors. And then they moved to a small town called Euroa, and that's where I was born. And my dad ran an ad in the paper promoting doing seminars. And as L.R.H. Hubbard wrote one of his books, he would send out chapters to his followers. And so my dad would do lectures on the chapters as they arrived. So he promoted his lecture, and he had 8 people come in for his first lecture. And by the end of the week, there was only 1 person left. And you actually know him, Ron. That's Noel Barton.
No kidding. He was my neighbor in England.
Yeah. Well, he started when I was born. He was friends with my parents. And so I've known him my whole life.
Wow, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
By the way, he's in Australia now, isn't he?
Yeah, he's in Perth. Yeah, we saw him last year. We took Dad down there, and they saw each other, and it was great.
Yeah.
So anyway, so my parents started a little group in Euroa, and then eventually we moved to the city of Melbourne, where they started their franchise. And that was going fine. They went to St. Hill and did their training on the St. Hill Special Briefing course directly under Hubbard in 1962, and returned to Australia. And then they ran into the government attempting to ban Scientology in Australia. And my mother actually got declared in 65 during the Victorian ban, the inquiry into it.
Now,
So
wait, Janis, when you say she got declared, there's a little more to that. You should, for our audience, explain that, okay?
Yeah, she got declared a suppressive person in 1965.
By the Church of Scientology.
By the Church of Scientology, yeah. The local organization had told her she was declared, and they were making up all sorts of reasons, with the inquiry. And the public that she had sent to the Hazy were refusing services at the Hazy and wanting to return to our franchise because she gave better service. And so anyway, she couldn't resolve that issue with the Hazy. She kept writing and calling St. Hill in England. And in 65, calling England can get pretty expensive, and it just wasn't resolving. So she then went to England. And it was at the same time that the government passed the banning of Scientology in Australia. So once she got in England, she handled her suppressive person declare and decided, let's move the whole family over there. So what happened is my parents were instrumental in moving over 100 families from Melbourne because of the ban to St. Hill in 1966 and 67. So that's how we ended up in England.
That's wild. I mean, your dad, of course, I know him. I met him many times now. Wonderful guy, a very charismatic individual. And that must have boomed the services purchased at St. Hill.
It definitely contributed to the booming of St. Hill and it making St. Hill size. There were a lot of Americans there too, because Hubbard had people going out and doing tours at that time, but 100 families from Australia in such a short time period definitely helped.
Okay, and let me just interject something. When she said St. Hill size, that's a certain amount of people, amount of services being delivered. It has to do with the magnitude of what you're doing as a Scientology organization. And that's an accomplishment that every organization tries to accomplish. Okay, so look, you're there now, but this continues. And from there, you ended up in the Sea organization, or actually your parents did, and you and your sister and your brother. Why don't we go into that right now?
Okay. Well, in 67, my mother was invited to join the Sea Project with Hubbard, where he had one ship already, the Enchanter, and he had just purchased the Avon River, and it was a piece of junk. It was a rusty tub, and it had been a fishing boat, and it was full of fish scale and, grime and oil. Anyway, so she went with a bunch of people up to Hull in England and helped renovate that ship. And that was the start of the Sea Project. Then she sailed with it down to Las Palmas from England. And I tell the story of that in my book. Everything I'm telling you is in the book. Anyway, she had left us children with Dad in England while she joined the Sea Project. But the agreement was, because she always said, I would never have joined if I hadn't been promised that you kids could follow. So finally, in January of 68, we followed, my brother, sister, and I, leaving our dad in England to wrap things up. And we arrived on the Royal Scotsman in January of 68, and our mother had sailed just a couple of days beforehand on the Avon River. So we show up and there is no mother. And then we're told that we need to be put to work to work for our board. We couldn't just sit around and wait for our mother to return. So my sister and I were put on dishwashing, and that was something we'd celebrated when we left England, thinking we'll never have to wash dishes again.
Wait a minute. Okay, not a pleasant surprise. But how old were you and Terry and your brother at that point?
I was 11, and Terry was 13, and my brother 14.
Right.
Yeah.
So continue on. I just
so Terry and I at 11, and she just turned 13, were assigned as dishwashers, and my brother at 14 was assigned pot washer. And so we had to wait for our mother to return. She sails back with the Avon, but she doesn't transfer back onto the Scotsman with us. And meanwhile, Mary Sue Hubbard, Hubbard's wife, has become our legal guardian until Mum returns. So then they sailed off again, and she was sent on a bunch of missions. So we were left without any parent. Then our father finally arrived, and he arrived just before the liability cruise was about to start.
Wait a minute, Janis. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Just go back and say what you said, because we had a glitcher, and I don't know if that got onto the recording.
Okay.
About somebody leaving. Who left?
Oh, my mother. My mother kept being sent off on missions or sailing with the Avon River. So we continued to remain parentless.
Right.
And then our father finally arrived just as the Royal Scotsman was assigned a condition of liability because we had dragged anchor and hit the rocks.
Jeez.
And so the idea was to assign us liability, and we were to go off on a training cruise and learn how to be sailors.
Okay.
And the AO there had been an advanced organization on the ship at the time when we arrived. So that was moved ashore in Spain, and the ship sailed off on the liability cruise. Now, my father had arrived just in time for that. So we had him with us, but my brother managed to transfer off the Royal Scotsman and get over onto the Avon. So he was with my mother. He just turned 15 when this happened. So he avoided the liability cruise. And I've got photographs of it where we get arrested in Spain for entering the country illegally. We'd been out doing lifeboat drills, and a storm picked up and we couldn't get back to the ship, and we ended up having to go into Spain. We had no money with us. We had no passports with us. And it was an adventure.
Yeah.
At 11 years old, with all these adults around you. And so I tell that story, and I've got photos in my book from it. And then finally we do get out of liability, and Hubbard comes aboard in May of 1968. And with him coming from the Avon onto the Royal Scotsman, it's a much bigger ship. And it would take him a lot of time. If he needed somebody, it would take him so much time to walk around the ship because we didn't have a intercom system. We only had a public announcing system where you go to the bridge and it'll announce everywhere on the ship.
Right.
So the night he came back aboard, Quentin was assigned to be a messenger for him. And then I was told to go and replace Quentin.
Quentin is L. Ron Hubbard's son.
Yes. And Quentin was probably 13 at the time, 13, 14 at the time. And I just turned 12 years old. So that was the start of the Commodore's Messengers, was Quentin going on watch, followed by me. And then we started doing watches 6 hours a day, and we still had other jobs. And then eventually we got replaced on the other jobs, and more girls were moved through, and boys actually, until finally it settled with four of us girls. Annie Tidman, everyone knows her as Annie Broker.
Right.
My sister Terry Gamboa, Claire Popham, or Claire Rousseau, and myself. We ended up being called the original 4 messengers.
I got it.
And we did 6 hours of watch a day with Hubbard, covering the 24-hour clock.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the start of Commodore's Messengers, just running messages for him to find people, take a dispatch to someone, go get something for him. And then as we learnt the ship and got older, we took on more and more responsibilities. Right. And it was probably just the 4 of us for the first 2 years. And then in 1970, 3 more messengers were added. And then, so there was then 7 of us for another 2 years until 1972. And those 3 added was Clarice Barnett Brousseau and Doreen Smith, Doreen Gillham, my sister-in-law, and Molly McBride. And so the 7 of us just did the watches, 2 of us on 3 of the watches, and then 1 person from midnight till 6 in the morning when Hubbard was asleep.
Right.
Then in 1972, in September, Hubbard and Mary Sue were going to go on a leave of absence and stay in his villa in Tangier. So we already had a property in Tangier that had been a translation unit, or it was used for overflow of students coming to the ship for training. Anyway, so we ended up going to what we called TRC, and Hubbard went to his villa called Villa Laurie. And we were there from September to December.
Well, wait a minute. If he was on a leave of absence, what did you do?
Well, he was on leave, but we were still there as messengers with him. He was still working.
Oh, okay.
Though he called it a leave, and we were only supposed to be there for 3 weeks, he was still working.
Yeah.
And the ship sailed off to Lisbon to go into dry dock.
Okay.
So we were left in Tangier, a small base, with Hubbard at the villa with Mary Sue. And then the ship was going to take longer to fix up. So we ended up staying there until December, when our interference with the politics of Morocco blew up in our face. And
hang on, when you say the interference, what interference was that, and who did it?
Well, there had been a coup on the King of Morocco.
Okay.
And we had offered our sect-checking services to the Moroccans to find who was behind the coup. And we had trained everyone on the ship that spoke French was trained to read the meter and do sect checks.
Meaning an interrogation you're going to do.
Interrogation, right. So we had sent a team to Rabat, and they were sect checking the various people involved around the king in the military, the various different leaders of the military.
Right.
And we had established from that, they did up a list of who was part of the revolution. And one of the members there from our sect checking team was trying to get the list to the king of who we'd come up with involved in the revolution.
Right.
And to get it to the king, he gave it to, unknowingly, he gave it to the head of the revolution.
Wonderful. Smart.
Which showed that we had down every name of the people involved in trying to overthrow the king.
Wow.
Now, people say, oh, Hubbard left Morocco because of the French fraud case and to avoid it. No, he left Morocco because we were now under the gun.
Yeah.
Because they knew that we had the list of who the revolutionists were against the king.
Well, if you were the revolutionary, I could see why they put you under the gun. But
well, we weren't the revolution, but we had the list.
I understand that.
Yeah.
But it was the revolutionaries that were saying, get the hell out of here, right?
Right. Right. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes. Yes. So that is when we got that phone call, I took the call. We're like, who's calling the villa? No one ever calls the villa. And I answered, and it was Rabat office. And they were like, I need to talk to the Commodore right away. And so when I got him on the phone, he turns to me, he's like, get my bag packed.
Wow.
So I got his steward, Andre Tabiyoya, and he packed his bag, and we got him into his car as fast as possible. They drove to Casablanca, and Andre got him on a flight over to Lisbon to the ship. The ship, is still a mess, everything torn apart in refit. He has nowhere to stay, at which point he and Jim Din and Paul Preston fly to New York.
Wow. Boy, there's an inside story. I don't know how many people know that, what you just revealed to us.
Yeah, not a lot of people do. And that story is actually covered in my second book, which I've just finished, and it's just getting wrapped up in editing and proofreading. It'll be released on the 1st of September.
Yeah, so don't look for that book now, but look for the first book.
Yes, look for the first book, A Commodore's Messenger, Child Adrift in the Scientology Sea Organization. And the second book is also Commodore's Messenger, Book 2, Riding Out the Storms.
Okay, so now L. Ron Hubbard went through Casablanca and Lisbon, right?
Yes.
Did he go to Rick's Cafe and maybe meet Humphrey Bogart?
No.
That's a great movie, Casablanca. That every time I hear the word Casablanca, I think of the movie. But anyway,
yeah,
my little 2 cents there. So now they're in New York. What happens then?
Well, they're in New York. I wasn't there. I just have the stories from Jim Dinkowski, who was with him.
Okay, but wait, before we go any further, look.
Yeah.
You worked with L. Ron Hubbard. How was it working with him? Were there any misadventures or adventures you can tell us about?
Well, there's a lot of adventures, and those are what I write in my book. I have adventures going into towns. I have adventures with some of the storms that we encountered.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about your personal relationship with L. Ron Hubbard. I mean, can you tell us any of those? You don't have to go. But
Well, I was with him every day for 6 hours practically of my life, and to me, people call it adventures, but to me, it was like, it was my life. It was, I never looked at it as something special, or it's nothing I regret or anything like that. I worked with him. He had times where he could be very charismatic, wonderful to be with, very mellow and jolly. And then there's times that he could just be absolutely explosive. And there's times that I would stand there and I'd listen to all his different stories or him talking to people. And I'd stand there and I'd go, well, that's not, I'd think to myself, well, that's not exactly how it happened. Or I would watch these people in fascination with him. And, then you kind of get a thought in your head and you're like, oh, I shouldn't be thinking that. And you quickly kind of push it to the back of your head, because you could get in trouble having thoughts that didn't align with what's going on.
Right.
And I looked at you look at Scientology, and I'll tell you, growing up in it, I saw a lot of people have life-changing wins with it. And I watched Hubbard I hear people say he's a con and stuff like that, but I watched him and I strongly felt he believed in what he was doing.
Yeah.
That was his purpose. He wasn't into getting money and spending and living high on the hog or anything like that. If someone had seen his quarters on the ship and how he lived, he had just a regular sized stateroom. It wasn't some magnificent mansion with gold plated, faucets and stuff like that. He just didn't go there. It was a stateroom, plain as could be, with a bed in it and a dresser and a fold-up card table for his sessions.
Yeah. Okay, well, I wanted to hear some of these things, and that was your experience with him, and that was nice of you to tell us that. Yeah. So now we're continuing on, and Jim how do you say his name?
Jim Dinkelsey.
He's in New York with L. Ron Hubbard.
Yes.
So continue the story from there, Janis.
Yeah, so they're in New York, and there is videos of Jim talking about it, and I also cover, some stories that Jim gave me in my new book. And meanwhile, we were in Lisbon getting the ship ready, and we did this is where CSP, Clean Ship Program, came from, where the crew members were given a few hours every Sunday to clean their cabins and that type of thing. Is CSP was when we did the Clean Ship Program, and we cleaned that ship from top to bottom, which had never been done, even when it was picked up and started in 1967. So having been a cattle ship, we were still finding manure.
Wow.
Hidden behind the vents, or a dead rat in the vents. And so we cleaned the whole ship. And to the point where the little people were gotten to climb into the vents to really scrub those out. So it was and we painted it white and, made it all pretty and stuff like that. Anyway, Hubbard came back in September of 1973 from New York.
Right.
And some people have said his bodies were switched. No, he wasn't switched. It was the same person that came back.
I never heard that.
Oh, you haven't? Oh, yeah. Yeah. There's been word that he was switched, and there's people saying, oh, Jim Dinkelsey was a CIA agent. No, that's just people making up stories.
Yeah, but you got to realize one thing. People will believe what they want to believe.
Absolutely correct.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So continue.
Anyway, so September 1973, Hubbard comes back aboard, and when he came, I was right there when he came aboard on duty, waiting for him. So he came aboard. I thought he'd say, oh, hi, honey, and, but he didn't. He just came right aboard and went straight upstairs, turned to me and said, get Mary Sue. And he went down to his cabin. And I went and got Mary Sue, told her he was here. She went down there, and when he came aboard, his hair was down to here. People have seen photographs of that. Right. And before he wanted to sit and talk to anybody, he had Mary Sue give him a haircut. Once he had the haircut and he'd showered and cleaned up from traveling, he came out and just started talking to the aides again like it was old times. And he knew the ship, he knew his way around, he knew everybody. So it wasn't a different person. Anyway, life continued. We got back into the old routine of everything. Sailing through storms, and Hubbard staying up till like 6 o'clock in the morning, case supervising. He would oversee the tech on the ship, the delivery. And, in between all this, let's not forget, there was brutality of, he did a Kali ceremony where, the auditors, if they messed up on their PCs.
Well, hang on a second. What do you mean a Kali ceremony?
Well, that's what I was about to explain. Okay. Kali was a goddess, and Hubbard had a statue of her done up, and his PR was to run this campaign of auditors who were messing up had to kneel before Kali and offer a sacrifice of something, or stab a mocked up PC folder. And it was actually very traumatic to a lot of people. And then managers of the orgs, if their org wasn't doing well, they had to do the same thing. And Neil Takali, and I write this story up in my book, and it's been on the internet, told by Monica Pignatti, who was actually there and one of those people. Anyway, so everything wasn't always hunky-dory. There was a lot, in the past, there'd been overboards that people talk about. There'd been chain lockers. And in talking about the chain lockers, when growing up with it, I never went to the chain locker myself, but my father was sent to the chain locker in the early days. And that's when he left the Sea Org, was after he'd been chain locked for like 3 days and left there, fed only bread and water.
Yeah, and let me just say something about that chain locker, because
yeah,
I wasn't there, obviously, but on the free wins, I, as part of the Golden Air Musicians, used to go down there to perform at their anniversary cruise every year. And one year we had berthing next to the chain locker. And I'm telling you, when that chain is let out and you're sitting next to it, you think, what the hell is happening? It sounds like the goddamn ship is coming apart. I cannot even imagine being in the same room when that chain is being let out. That has got to be like a living nightmare to anybody. Did you ever hear that chain being let out?
Oh, yeah. It vibrates the whole ship. But when the chain's let out, people are not in the chain locker.
Okay.
They'd be killed.
Yeah, I'm glad you cleared that up, because the chain is flipping all over the goddamn place.
Oh, yeah. It rattles back and forth like this as it's going out. The whole ship vibrates. And there's no way anyone could be in that chain locker, because it would have pulled them out with it and just tangled them up and destroyed them. So, yeah. But no, they would sit in, it's a dark, cold hole. And you sit on the chain, and the only light that comes in is during the day. It's coming through the hole where the chain goes out in the side of the ship.
And your dad was put there?
My dad was put there, yeah. And
given bread and water, is that right?
Bread and water. And while he was there, he was declared a suppressive person. So he had to do his A to E while he was in the chain locker.
Wow.
To get out.
And I know your dad, if there is anybody who's not a suppressive person, it's got to be him, okay?
Right. My father is funny. I found some papers just yesterday where after he moved to America, he would travel the U.S. and go to the franchises and the different orgs, lecturing on Scientology, doing introduction lectures.
Wow.
And people would show up for these lectures where he packed rooms, just knowing he was coming. 200 people sometimes would be in that lecture hall just to hear him speak. And the Regs were like overwhelmed with people wanting to sign up for their first Scientology services, because my dad had a way in actually explaining it to people and giving examples and answering their questions. It was a live two-way communication going on in those rooms. And he probably brought in more people than anybody else.
Yeah, he's a very personable guy. I can see that happening.
Yes.
Okay, so back to the ship and your dad getting declared there.
Yeah, so because he was declared, of course, my sister and I were pulled in and told we needed to disconnect from him. So I was still 11 at this time. And, we, in our tears, we're crying away as we're writing our little disconnection letters. And they actually didn't give our disconnection letters to our dad, which was probably a good thing. Because, why hit somebody even harder when they're down? Yeah. But they mailed them to our brother over on the Avon River, because he has the same name. And so our brother's over on the Avon River, and he's like, why are my sisters disconnecting from me?
Wow.
And, so that's just a little side story. But even my brother over on the Avon River was chain locked. He was working in the engine room at the time, and Hannah was the captain, and she'd come down and she'd said something about some grease on the floor, and he's like,
flipping it. Well, what do you expect? It's an engine room. So he was sent to the chain locker
because of saying something that's true.
For being flippant.
Yeah, it's just the attitude of the arrogance of the higher ups was immense in those days, wasn't it?
Yeah. It was crazy.
Yeah.
You let power get to people's head and they can do some major damage to anybody else.
I'm telling you, I've observed that familiarly.
Right.
David, powers corrupted him because he wasn't always that way. He went from this to this.
Right.
Go on, Janis.
Right. All right. So we're back on the ship, and we're sailing around the Atlantic, going port to port. We keep getting booted out of different ports, and in writing my book, someone had sent me some documentation that the Guardian's office had gotten, where through the Freedom of Information Act, it's various telexes from the different embassies to the Secretary of State of the U.S. And they're tracking us. Every port we're going to, the embassies are reporting on where we are. The different places are trying to find us. And so I got all these different telegrams, and I've included them throughout my book to show it wasn't just Hubbard being delusional about being followed and tracked. They were actually following him and reporting and calling us a slave ship, which, that's very close to the truth because we were on such, we did a lot of free labor.
Yeah.
They said we were drug smuggling, said we had prostitutes on board, we had draft dodgers, and there were draft dodgers on board, people saying they were ministers in order to not go to Vietnam.
Well, that's true, though.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we keep getting kicked out of ports, and then the final one was Madeira, where the locals actually gather rocks and put them in the trunks of the taxis and come down to the dock and start throwing rocks at the ship, calling us CIA and wanting us to leave. And Kimmer got hit in the jaw and actually got a broken jaw from one of the rocks. Someone else got hit in the head, and we had some crew damaged. I happened to have been on Liberty that day, and Mary Sue had been on Liberty, and Diana, and half the crew were on Liberty. So when we were coming back to the ship, we were like, don't go back to the ship, we're all meeting up at the Sheraton. So we were up at the Sheraton, dancing in the nightclub, looking out the window, trying to pretend that we weren't from the ship. And then we watched the ship finally pull out from dock and go out to anchor to get away from the rock throwers. And I go into that in my book, and I actually have talked to different people who were all there. So it's kind of this, I put the story together from a multiple viewpoint of different people, of what was happening where and when and that type of thing. And I've had other people read the story and they're like, oh, this really covers it so well.
Yeah.
Anyway, we call that the Rock Festival.
Right.
And we end up leaving Madeira, pretending to go sail down south, because we don't realize, we're old-fashioned. Our radars, don't reach out very far, where the rest of the world has higher technology than us and our ship. So we start heading south to make them think we're going down to Africa, and we end up then crossing the Atlantic, going over to Bermuda, and then we sail. After Bermuda, we're going to sail into Charleston and actually come to the U.S. But once we cross over from international waters into American waters, we get notice. Jane Kemper actually radios the ship and the radio operator comes to the bridge, because we're on the bridge. I'm on the bridge with Hubbard, and he's a little nervous. He's got full condition 1 on the bridge as we're sailing towards America. And the radio operator comes up and says, tell the Commodore that Jane Kemper's on the radio for him. So I tell him, and we're like, why would she be calling? So we go down the radio room, and she's telling us that there's agents, IRS agents with subpoenas. There's DEA is on the dock, and she suspects they'll probably want to plant drugs on the ship in order to confiscate the ship upon our arrival. So as soon as he gets that message, we're back up on that bridge and we're spinning it around and heading back out into international waters, and then we go down into the Caribbean from there.
Right.
And I give details on that in the book, and how it's suspected that they knew that we were coming in and that type of thing. Anyway, so we end up then down in the Caribbean for a year, and Hubbard starts doing shoots. And what a lot of people don't know, and that is from those shoots, you know, he would do that for the Scientology promotion and that type of thing. And his accountant billed the church for his work on that. It wasn't that he was on Sea Org pay or anything. He was getting paid by Scientology to do those photographs and put the magazines and things like that together. Right. And anyway, after a year in the Caribbean, he got deathly ill. Despite his resistance, Kimmer had him put in the hospital in Curacao, and he was in intensive care for a couple of days, and we were all kind of, what will happen to us, you know, if he dies? It was such a hit and miss on if he was going to make it or not. Wow. And then he pulled through and ends up going back on the ship. And then it was decided, you know, he's not in that great a health if this, you know, if that happens. Yeah. And Mary Sue had some issues too. So he would say he wanted to move ashore in order to give Mary Sue, because she never liked the tight spaces on the ship. And so to give her a house and a better life, he wanted to move ashore. So we end up moving to Daytona. Mm-hmm. While the Guardian's office and missions are out trying to find locations for us. And the specific orders to the missionaries looking for locations for us to move to a base were, it had to have an international airport. Right. Well, the missionaries checked when they found the Fort Harrison was for sale by Jack Tar. They checked, where's the nearest airport? The nearest airport's Tampa. Oh, it's international. What they didn't check is, how did it have the title of international? It flew flights to Mexico. Oh, boy. So because it was international, Hubbard thought it flew to Europe and everywhere else. And that is why the Fort Harrison was purchased. Wow. That's not a well-known fact. I didn't know that, as a matter of fact. Yeah. So anyway, did you go ashore? Were you in with the organization at the Fort Harrison? Yes, I was. Well, what happened actually is I was on mission at AOLA when everybody from the ship was moved to Daytona. Right. So when I returned from mission, everyone was in Daytona. So I went back on my messenger watches, and Hubbard was a few doors down in a high-rise condo from the hotel that the staff were at. And so I would go on watches with him there, and then he sent me on mission. As soon as we closed, no, we hadn't yet closed. We were in escrow on the Fort Harrison when he sent myself and Hannah and David Mayo on mission to the Fort Harrison, and we worked out all the space planning and then sent that to him, got it approved so that when everyone was ready to move and we closed escrow, everyone knew exactly where everything was going. David, Hannah, and I worked that out. Right. And LRH personally was running all the different missionaries to set up the land base. And then we all moved. The Guardian's office didn't want Hubbard to move into the Fort Harrison yet, though there was a penthouse that was allocated to him. But they wanted him first to live somewhere else until everything had settled down. So right. That's when we went out to Dunedin. We lived at King Arthur's Court in Dunedin. And we would go in and out of the land base. We had vans we called the Green Ball and the Red Ball. And those would go between King Arthur's Court and the FH. Okay, so now, I tell you, it seems like things are going well for you. Where did you ever get in trouble or anything? I got in trouble plenty of times. You know, when we were on the ship, I was actually off on liberty one day. We were in Tenerife in the Canary Islands, and Hubbard had assigned the messengers, because we're older and more responsible, to ease his lines. He had assigned us each responsible for a division of the ship.
I got it.
So I was responsible for HCO, which is communications, personnel, and ethics.
Right.
I was off on liberty when one of the messengers who'd been on a late watch woke up with a man in her room trying to molest her. And when Hubbard found, and she of course screamed and, got him out, and, it was like, we had to have a pedophile on board. So I was on liberty, and Hubbard immediately says, well, who's in charge of HCO? I am. Yeah. So he has them find me. Someone came ashore looking for me on the island to tell me I had to come back to the ship. And of course, I'm assigned a lower condition because HCO was on Hubbard's plate. And I hadn't handled it sufficiently that they had let a pedophile stay on the ship and not be found out about before he molested somebody. So that's just an example of getting in trouble. We used to, as messengers, we were young teenagers.
Yeah.
We would get in trouble. The U.S. Navy would sail into a port and dock right next to us, and we were up on the poop deck, and they would started throwing nuts and bolts up at us. And so we got some from the engine room, and we threw them back at them. And then we went for a walk on the dock, and the Navy boys are throwing potatoes at us because they'd been sitting out on deck peeling potatoes. So they start throwing potatoes at us girls as we're walking by. So we throw the potatoes back, and we get into this big potato fight with the U.S. Navy. And when their admiral comes back to the ship, they're like signaling us to stop throwing potatoes. The admiral comes back aboard, goes below deck, and the potatoes come back out again. Well, Captain Bill takes a walk along the dock and sees us throwing potatoes at the U.S. Navy. And the next thing you know, we're being called back aboard and pushed down to ethics, that we're in trouble because you shouldn't be doing that. Anyway, I later tell Hubbard how we have been restricted to the ship because we were throwing potatoes at the U.S. Navy. And he thought it was pretty funny. And he actually commended us because we were good. We had good public relations with the Navy. While those assigned to handle public relations were afraid of them. And we ended up with the Navy guys bringing a projector to the ship and the latest movie and setting it up on the deck. And all the crew came out and watched a movie. Wow. So that's an example of getting in trouble.
Okay. All right. So then your career with Scientology, where does it go after that? I mean, where did it go downhill that you actually felt like you had to get out? What brought that about?
There's been periods where I'd felt I had to get out. It was because it was never my choice. I was there because my parents had wanted me there. Yeah. And it was my life. I went along with it. I didn't know anything else. And I would see other people, and I might daydream or something. Boy, what would it be like to have a regular school, or what would it have been like to have a regular job or friends? I had no prom or the usual type of thing, but I don't regret that because I had a special life, and I had a lot of good moments in it, and there was bad moments. And I look at other people's lives, and I had a decent life in comparison to a lot of people. There was always food on the table, Yeah. Anyway, once we got older, we took on more responsibilities, and we ended up taking over doing management because Hubbard was off the lines and couldn't handle a lot of it, and was training us to take over management. And I got involved in the management, and Dave was also involved in management at the same time. And Dave actually was a great friend. Dave is your son. Your son, David Miscavige. Yeah, I always call him Dave.
Listen, I know who you're referring to, but I want to make sure anybody listening not losing the trend here.
Right, yeah. But anyway, Dave was a good friend. He was one of the messengers. We always goofed off together and that type of thing. You know, we took liberties together. But that was before he gained power. And as Hubbard went more and more off the lines, I became more and more vocal, to the point where I was objecting to things coming down from Hubbard because I felt he wasn't being told the truth. And if I could only get word to him on what the real scene was, I felt that I could do something to change the atmosphere as it was getting more and more evil. And because having worked with Hubbard for so long on the ship, I knew that depending on how I answered a message to him depended on if that person at the other end was going to be in trouble or not. So based off of that experience and seeing the responses coming down from Hubbard, that, you know, the whole mission holder thing or the brutality on the Golden Era staff told me that lies were being sent up, or the reports were being done to make whoever's writing the report the big hero on saving the day, rather than, wait a minute, all these people are here volunteering their lives as staff members to help with a purpose, and they're not evil, but the way they were being treated was as if they were evil.
Yeah.
And just seeing that, and then myself getting declared for mouthing off and disagreeing with things. And then when Hubbard found out that I was in trouble, being a troublemaker, he didn't know that they had offloaded me and declared me. This was in probably 82. And he wrote down, and this was the first advice on the running program, and it says basically to have Janis get out and run. And so I'd been offloaded. They were trying to get my husband to divorce me, and he refused. And he was like, let me go with her. She's never been out in the real world. You know, I need to be with her and help her get set up.
Right.
And then I was like, where do I go? And I said, the only person I know out there is my dad. But if I'm declared, he can't take me in. And they're like, well, we really know you're not an SP, so go and stay with your dad.
Wow.
So in the middle of the morning, around 3 o'clock in the morning, after I'd arrived at my dad's, I get a phone call, and my husband had been instructed to try and get me to come back because Hubbard had written that advice. It was the first advice, as I'd said, on the running program. So I came back, saw David Mayo, and just ran. And so I was the first guinea pig on the running program.
Okay, but did you just run aimlessly, or did you run around a pole?
No, the poll had not come out yet.
Okay.
Based off the reports from me, where I was just running everywhere, that's when Hubbard then writes down about the poll.
That's interesting.
Yeah, but it was just to get out and run. That was the very first advice.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was supposed to calm me down so that I wasn't so disaffected. Because David Mayo had written a report and said that Janis is no longer disaffected, but I have no guarantee she won't be disaffected in the future. Right. And that's when they decided to declare me, because he had no guarantee I wouldn't go against everything. But, you know, to me, what was going on just was not the Scientology that I grew up with. And it doesn't align with the basic purpose of Scientology or the axioms or the factors or all that real early stuff. You know, it just didn't align with it. Yeah. So, you know, and you got to realize when I was in there, I think very differently to how I think today. You know, because you're a very dedicated staff member with the purpose, and the disconnection that goes on today was not the same. A definition of who an SP is not the same.
Right.
Because anybody's being declared SP now because they're disagreeing with management.
That's true.
And So they're being disconnected from, or they're just under the radar or whatever because of what's going on. But that's not how it used to be or how it's supposed to have been dealt with. Sorry. Anyway, so I come back after being declared, do the running program, and slowly I get back into management, and I'm back in the watchdog committee. And then I'm used as a troubleshooter. The ship's not ready for the maiden voyage, so I'm sent to the ship because there's very few people in the Sea Org left who knew ships. So I was sent to the Free Winds to set it up for the very first maiden voyage. And then I was just used to troubleshoot different things. I was the chief officer, CMO International, and I was the deputy watchdog committee chairman. Anyway, my husband ended up being sent to the RPF, and then he got back. He finished it and came back, and I was still being used to troubleshoot, and I was sent to the Free Winds again. And this was probably 1990 now, and I was sent to the Free Winds to take over as the commanding officer of the ship. And my husband had been sent on mission, and he had reported up that the Flag Service Org, the FSO, was off purpose, and what's different things that he had found which were contrary to what management was pushing. So he ended up being pulled back and in trouble. Yeah. So they then decide, well, we got to make sure that Janis gets back here because Paul's being a problem. And they made the mistake of sending me back with an escort.
Right.
I'm like, what the hell? I'm the commanding officer of the ship right now. I gave up my job as the deputy watchdog committee in order to do this. And here they are sending me back with a guard.
Now, something's fishy. Huh?
Yes, something is fishy.
Right.
And so I'm like, and my sister had already left. And so when I hit Miami, I'm like, I know my sister's down in the Miami area. How can I find her? But it wasn't the day of cell phones. I'd have to get to a payphone, and having a guard on me, I couldn't get to a payphone.
Right.
I'd go into the ladies, and I'd come out, and he's standing right there. There was like, he was going to make sure I arrived in LA in one piece.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, so that's where it started going for me. It's like, why am I being treated like this? 22 years in the Sea Org, and I'm being treated like this?
Yeah, at best, it's not right.
Right. Yeah.
Worst, it's terrible. But now, you're running actually into a little bit of a time constraint here.
Okay.
I find this very interesting. But what then put the nail in the coffin, so to speak? How did it happen that you left?
Well, what happened is I had a feeling I was pregnant, and it just happened to be at the same time we had the flood at the base, and we were all pulled in, and it was everybody's fault that the base had gotten damaged during the flood.
I was there.
Yes.
I see. It was insane.
Right. Right. So at that point was when Paul and I kind of looked at each other, and I said, I'll drive the car, and he said, I'll drive the bike. And we lived off base. And we didn't have to just say words, really. It was just we both had that same thing at the same time. And so we took both the vehicles to where we lived off base. And it just so happened that my aunt and uncle were in town from Australia. And it was said my husband couldn't go with me, though I'd had it approved. And we ended up, everyone was pulled back into the base at 11 o'clock at night. It was perfect. We're loading up the car for me to go visit my uncle and aunt.
Right.
And I was going to drop Paul at the base. And instead of turning right, we turned left.
There you go.
And we went to my brother's, and I hadn't seen him in 8 years, and we spent our first night out camping at Point Magoo in California on the beach.
And here we are today.
Here we are today.
You're a writer, and these are interesting stories, I'm telling you. And I hope everybody who watches this goes on to Amazon and gets the book. And remember, there's another one coming out in September.
Yes.
You definitely should buy as a follow-up, because this is this is a story. It's a chronological. Am I using that?
Right.
Yeah, it's a chronology of what happened in a Sea organization from the viewpoint of somebody who was there. You weren't told this by somebody else. You were actually there. You worked with L. Ron Hubbard, and you saw all these things take place.
Correct. Now, before we end off, I do want to say that on the 22nd of September in Las Vegas, I am holding an event to help promote everybody who has written books about their own experience in Scientology. So yourself is supposed to be there. Mark Headley will be there. Amy Scobie will be there. Nancy Maney will be there. You know, all these various different authors plan to be there at the 22nd of September in Vegas.
And there's the commercial for the. It didn't cost you a penny. And talking about not costing you a penny, remember, folks, this my producer and I are doing on our own dime. So if you would go to Patreon, if you'd like to hear these programs continue, I'd appreciate it very much if you could help us a bit so we could continue on. And it's my pleasure to do it, though. I mean, no matter what happens, I'm going to continue doing this. But lastly, I want to thank you very much for coming on, Janis. This has been a real pleasure to have you here.
You're welcome. I've enjoyed it. Thanks, Ronnie.
Okay, and I'm Ron Miscavige, and this is Life After Scientology. Until the next episode, see you then.